In my last video, I filled you in on what Harry Potter got up to after the events of the Deathly Hallows. Specifically, I did a deep dive on anything and everything related to Harry between the years of 1998, Voldemort's defeat, and 2025, today. Since the books and films ended, there really hasn't been much additional info published on the Wizarding World, which is why I felt the need to fill in that 27-year gap and provide some clarity on what sort of man he became and what he did with his life. Today, we're going to be doing the same thing for Draco Malfoy, taking a closer look at his life in a post-war era. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. At just 18 years old, Draco was a marked man, not just in the literal sense with a fading dark mark burned into his arm, but also in the eyes of the Wizarding World. He was the son of a known Death Eater, raised in a pureblood supremacist household, and someone who had once nearly murdered Dumbledore, albeit reluctantly. And while Draco started out as just a regular school bully, he was a fully fledged Death Eater by the time the Second Wizarding War had concluded, and the Wizarding community was very much aware of this. After Lucius's failures, Voldemort began to wage psychological warfare on the Malfoys, punishing not just Lucius, but also his family. And so, from the Half-Blood Prince onward, Draco became little more than a pawn in Voldemort's twisted game. And his first mission as a Death Eater, the impossible task of killing Albus Dumbledore. Voldemort exploited their fear, their pride, and their desperation, pushing them past the point of no return, which meant that by the time the final battle approached, their loyalty had crumbled. Before Voldemort had even been defeated, Narcissa found herself lying to him in order to protect her son. And Draco, when push came to shove, found himself entirely unable to pull the trigger and cast the killing curse on his former headmaster. These were no longer the actions of a family that believed in Voldemort's cause. They weren't driven by ideology or blind loyalty anymore. They were driven by fear, self-preservation, and above all, love for one another. But when Voldemort did finally die, they were in a precarious position indeed. On the one hand, they were likely relieved, free at last from his control. But on the other, they knew how the rest of the Wizarding World saw them: Death Eaters, traitors, loyal servants of the Dark Lord. And with Voldemort gone, they lost the twisted protection that came with serving him. Their future now lay in the hands of those who'd fought against him, the so-called good guys. And when it became clear that Voldemort's defeat was imminent, the Malfoys didn't stay to fight. Instead, they turned their backs on the battlefield, retreating from Hogwarts in shame. But what happened to them next? Were they locked away in Azkaban for their past crimes, or did their apparent remorse lead them down a different path entirely? 1998. Following Voldemort's defeat, it's later revealed that the Malfoys were able to avoid Azkaban by relaying crucial information to the Ministry of Magic in the aftermath of the war. With Voldemort gone and the Wizarding World in disarray, the Ministry was desperate to track down the remaining Death Eaters and restore order. The sooner they could locate and extinguish the remaining embers of Death Eater activity, the better. And so Lucius, seeking redemption, or possibly just self-preservation, offered names, locations, and secrets in exchange for his family's freedom. And fortunately for them, given the sheer scale of what the Wizarding World had just endured, the Ministry saw value in cooperation over punishment. In the end, they walked free, stained by their past, yes, but granted the opportunity to rebuild. And no one had more to rebuild than Draco. While his parents faded from public life, Draco faced the daunting challenge of growing up in a world that no longer feared his last name, but certainly hadn't forgotten it. He was now a man shaped by war, by failure, and by the realization that everything he once believed in had crumbled beneath him. And the first thing he did was denounce his belief in pureblood superiority. The events of Draco's late teens forever changed his life. He had had the beliefs with which he'd grown up challenged in the most frightening way. He had experienced terror and despair, seen his parents suffer for their allegiance, and had witnessed the crumbling of all that his family had believed in. People whom Draco had been raised or else had learned to hate, such as Dumbledore, had offered him help and kindness, and Harry Potter had given him his life. After the events of the Second Wizarding War, Lucius found his son as affectionate as ever, but refusing to follow the same old pure bloodline. Following Voldemort's defeat, it didn't take long for Hogwarts to be rebuilt, and for many, returning to complete their education felt like the obvious choice. But unsurprisingly, Draco Malfoy was among those who chose not to return. Though Draco and his family were pardoned for their crimes, Draco had still damaged his image beyond repair, and his association with Voldemort, however reluctant by the end, cast a long shadow over his reputation. Returning to Hogwarts would have meant facing his peers, many of whom had fought against the very forces his family once supported. It also would have meant confronting the ghosts of his past in the very corridors where he had once held so much misplaced pride. He was also in the extremely fortunate position of coming from wealth, which meant that he didn't need to complete his studies or really work at all. Instead, he simply withdrew from the public eye and focused on personal growth, determined to reinvent himself as someone better than the boy he had once been. 2000. After some time of self-reflection, Draco Malfoy eventually re-emerged a better man. He certainly wasn't perfect, and his shift in attitude certainly didn't atone for the past crimes that he had committed, but he was determined to move forward and pave the way for a better future. And it was shortly after this period of self-reflection that he began courting a young woman by the name of Astoria Greengrass. Astoria was unlike anyone Draco had ever met. Calm, thoughtful, and fiercely independent, she carried herself with quiet strength and grace. Though she too came from a pure-blood family, and one on the Sacred 28 to boot, Astoria had long rejected the elitist ideals that had once shaped their world, ideals that Draco himself had spent years trying to unlearn. She began attending Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry in 1993, 2 years below Draco, and while they had crossed paths at school, it wasn't until years later, after the war, after the dust had settled, that their real connection began to blossom. She challenged him in ways he didn't expect, not with harsh words or judgment, but with compassion and a perspective that was rooted in kindness and reason. Astoria didn't see him as the boy who had stood by Voldemort's side, but rather as the man who had chosen to walk away from that darkness. Over time, their bond grew, slowly but deeply, and for perhaps the first time in his life, Draco found someone who saw through the facade, someone who encouraged him not to run from his past, but to grow from it. With Astoria by his side, Draco began to find peace, not just with the world, but with himself. 2002. After several years together, Draco and Astoria eventually decided to tie the knot and get married. However, this occasion didn't come without its fair share of controversy. You see, despite Astoria coming from a pure-blood family, Draco's parents didn't quite approve of her. You may have thought that a fellow member of the Sacred 28 would have been more than enough to appease them, but to Lucius and Narcissa, Astoria represented a departure from tradition. She didn't adhere to the old pure-blood customs, nor did she share the same reverence for blood status that had defined so much of the Malfoy legacy. In their eyes, Astoria was too progressive, too lenient in her views about Muggleborns and blood traitors, and while she wasn't particularly outspoken or political, her quiet defiance of outdated ideologies was enough to ruffle some feathers in Malfoy Manor. And this is where Draco truly proved that he had changed. In years past, he'd always lived to please his parents, to carry the weight of the Malfoy name with pride and obedience. But now he stood firm in his own convictions, and despite the protests from his mother and father, he went ahead with marrying Astoria anyway. Astoria would later describe his actions as one of the most courageous things she'd ever seen. And so together, the newlyweds embarked on the next chapter of their lives. 2004. Though Draco and Astoria had a wonderful marriage and home life together, it wasn't all sunshine and daisies. And just a few years into their marriage, Astoria began to develop increasingly worse symptoms derived from her family's blood curse. We were capable of having children, but Astoria was frail. A blood malediction, a serious one. An ancestor was cursed. It showed up in her. You know how these things can resurface after generations. A maledictus curse is applied to and inherited through a witch or wizard's bloodline. A dark curse that is passed on through generations of family members and is transferred from mother to daughter. Typically, it causes someone to slowly transform into an animal over the course of their life, like we see with Nagini, although it can manifest in other ways as well. It's an awful curse that you're born with and have no way out of, an inescapable curse that eats away at you, slowly stripping away your identity. But despite all of this, Astoria remained remarkably strong. She never allowed her condition to define her, and she never asked for pity. In many ways, her resilience in the face of quiet suffering only deepened Draco's love and admiration for her. He was determined to support her in whatever way he could. But Astoria's condition stirred further disapproval among those who already questioned her place within the Malfoy family. Some saw her illness as a weakness, a stain on the bloodline, and others speculated about whether she could have had children at all, given the risk of passing on the malediction. However, despite all of this, Draco and Astoria made the courageous decision to have a child. 2006. In 2006, Draco and Astoria welcomed their son, Scorpius Hyperion Malfoy, into the world. Knowing that she wouldn't be around forever, Astoria wanted to have a child to ensure that Draco would have someone to hold on to after she was gone. And despite Draco telling her that he didn't care if the Malfoy name ended with him, Astoria persisted. She wanted to give him a family, someone to love, but the cost ended up being steep. The pregnancy nearly destroyed her, and her already frail body suffered immensely. And so after Scorpius was born, the Malfoys withdrew from public life, retreating into quiet seclusion. However, not before long, some sinister rumors began to circulate. 2007. Due to Astoria's health concerns, rumors began to circulate that Astoria had been unable to conceive, and that she had in fact turned to dark magic, using a time turner to go back and have a child with Lord Voldemort himself. Yeah, the story was absurd, but it didn't take long for the damage to be done, and Scorpius would later carry that burden during his time at Hogwarts. However, through it all, Astoria remained consistent in her values, and unlike the traditional Malfoy ideology, she refused to raise Scorpius with blood purity beliefs, rejecting the notion that Muggles were somehow inferior. This did, however, put her at odds with Draco's parents, Lucius and Narcissa, who viewed her as a disappointing daughter-in-law. They had had high hopes of a girl whose family featured on the Sacred 28, but as Astoria refused to raise their grandson Scorpius in the belief that Muggles were scum, family gatherings were often fraught with tension. And as the years went on, Draco slowly began to change too. His time with Astoria reshaped him. This is touched on by Rowling. He seemingly mellowed out a bit, leading a life of leisure instead of working to overturn the forces of light or establish dominion over Muggles, like Lucius did. I imagine that Draco grew up to lead a modified version of his father's existence. Independently wealthy, without any need to work, Draco inhabits Malfoy Manor with his wife and son. I see in his hobbies further confirmation of his dual nature. The collection of dark arts artifacts harks back to family history, even though he keeps them in glass cases and does not use them. However, his strange interest in alchemical manuscripts, from which he never attempts to make a philosopher's stone, hints at a wish for something other than wealth, perhaps even the wish to be a better man. I have high hopes that he will raise Scorpius to be a much kinder and more tolerant Malfoy than he was in his own youth. And so far, this just about covers everything up to the epilogue. 2017. The Harry Potter epilogue occurs 19 years after the original story ends in the year 2017, and it's during this brief glimpse into the future that we witness Draco and Astoria sending Scorpius off to Hogwarts at platform 9 3/4. And in the same moment, we see Draco's former rival, Harry Potter, sending his own children off to school. But the moment was bittersweet for them. Astoria had lived to see her son off to Hogwarts, a dream she once feared she'd never reach. But deep down, she knew she may not be there when he returns. And by this time, the blood malediction that had haunted her had taken its toll, and her strength had really begun to fade. Despite the heavy burden of his family name and the cruel rumors that had followed him since birth, Scorpius embarked on his Hogwarts journey as a kind-hearted, shy, and intelligent boy, a clear reflection of Astoria's influence. On the train, Scorpius sat alone in an empty compartment, quietly hoping someone might join him, and his wish was granted when Albus Potter and Rose Granger Weasley entered. Scorpius introduced himself with a nervous smile and offered them sweets from his stash. While Rose chose to leave shortly after, Albus stayed behind, half joking that it was only for the sweets. But the two quickly bonded. By the time the train reached Hogwarts, their friendship had already begun to take root. Upon arrival, Scorpius was sorted into Slytherin House, the same house as his father, and to his surprise, Albus joined him there, breaking from the long-standing Potter family tradition of Gryffindor. This unexpected turn only deepened their friendship, as both boys soon found themselves as outsiders. Scorpius mocked and whispered about because of the persistent rumor that he was Voldemort's son, and Albus ridiculed for being a Potter in Slytherin. And so, Scorpius and Albus grew inseparable. 2019. In 2019, shortly before Scorpius' third year at Hogwarts, disaster struck when Astoria finally succumbed to her awful blood malediction. She died young, as she had always known she would, but not before leaving a lasting mark on those closest to her. For Draco, the loss was profound, and without her, the world felt much colder and emptier. It broke Draco's heart to the extent that he even considered using his father's illegal time turner, a device he'd hidden away in secret, just to see her one more time. The temptation was overwhelming, to stand beside her, to hear her voice again. But in the end, he couldn't do it. He knew it wasn't what Astoria would have wanted. However, that time turner did end up being used. There's a lot that happens next, but I'm not just going to regurgitate the entire Cursed Child story, so I'll just summarize Draco's involvement. 2020. In The Cursed Child, the secret daughter of Lord Voldemort and Bellatrix Lestrange, born shortly before the Battle of Hogwarts, devises a plan to use a time turner to go back to 1981 and prevent Voldemort's downfall by stopping him from trying to kill baby Harry Potter. Draco eventually steps in and helps by revealing that he possesses a rare, highly advanced prototype time turner, and joins Harry, Ron, and Ginny in using the device to travel back to the past in order to track down and stop Delphi. Together, they follow her to Godric's Hollow on the night of October 31st, 1981, the very night Voldemort went to kill Harry. And after a brief but intense confrontation, Delphi is defeated and taken into custody. This experience ultimately transforms Draco's relationship with his former rivals. Through working closely with Harry, Hermione, and the others, Draco begins to shed the weight of old grudges and prejudices, and eventually comes to genuinely trust them, especially Harry, for whom he develops a newfound sense of mutual respect. Draco even openly acknowledges Harry as a friend, a major shift from the animosity and competition that defined their youth. 2025. Today, Draco is 45 years old, a father, a widower, and a man that has grown immensely from the trials and tribulations of his youth. He lives for his son, whom he raised largely alone, and while he's still reserved, still cautious, he's no longer cruel or bitter. He's a man that survived the war, learned from his past, and worked quietly to become a better person. And in the end, he doesn't seek attention, and he doesn't look for forgiveness. He just tries to do right by his son. In the words of J.K. Rowling, there is, after all, some unextinguished good at the heart of Draco. And that's it for this video. Who do you want me to do this for next? Let me know down in the comment section below. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live.